So this is our poetry presentation on Sound and Sense by Alexander Pope.
So some background and context behind this poem. It was actually not written as a poem by itself. Instead, he included it into one of his more famous works that was known as an essay on criticism. This essay was designed to respond to critics that were criticizing his works, and it's basically a tutorial on how to create poetry. He was only 23 years old when he wrote this poem, and his reputation really skyrocketed off of the success of this essay. Like I said, it's one of his more popular works. When you think of Alexander Pope, most historians are going to say an essay on criticism, among other works, but that was his most famous. He's one of the greatest early 18th century poets around. When you think poet, you think a lot about like people like William Shakespeare, not necessarily Alexander Pope, but he still made his mark and had his impression on poetry and literature. His childhood was filled with turmoil. He had a ton of health problems. His spine was curved so that he had constant pain in his back and several other of his joints. And as a result of this, a lot of his enemies made fun of him. And many of his works are satire because of this. He develops this satirical verse because his enemies made fun of him. He decided to take some jabs back at him.
So this is the full poem. True ease in writing comes from art, not chance. As those move easiest to have learned to dance, 'tis not enough to harshness gives offense. The sound must seem an echo to the sense. Soft is the strain when zephyr gently blows, and the smooth stream in smoother numbers flows. But when loud surges lash the sounding shore, the hoarse, rough verse should like the torrent roar.
When Ajax drives some rock's vast weight to throw, the line too labors and the words move slow. Not so when swift Camilla scours the plain, flies o'er the unbending corn, and skims along the main. Hear how Timotheus varied lay surprise, and bid alternate passions fall and rise.
The poem type, it's all written in iambic pentameter. It's not really a sonnet because it doesn't follow the structure of a sonnet, but it fits all the criteria for iambic pentameter. It's in rhymed verse and has end rhyme with an AABBCC rhyme scheme, and it's a masculine rhyme, so all of the ending words share the same last syllable. Literary devices, it has a lot of allusion in it. It references Zephyr, the west wind, who is a figure in Greek mythology, and he appears in a lot of myths. And they sort of use that to reference and talk about the wind. Ajax is a figure from the Iliad who fought in the Trojan War to show power and display power. And Camilla and Timotheus are both from mythology. Camilla was a swift queen, and Timotheus was a poet, I believe. Continued literary devices, consonants. It's not, because it's not alliteration, there's a repeated sound, but not at the beginning of the word, because numbers and flows has the S sound at the end. And assonance is used when in the line as those move easiest to have learned to dance, because the O sound is the same in all of those words. Overstatement is also used. It's used in a lot of places, but when sound surges lash the sounding shore, the hoarse, rough voice should be heard, should like the torrent roar. So obviously it's not literally going to be a loud roaring noise, but it should have the power of a torrent or a raging river.
So going on to the meaning, again, this is Pope's view of how poetry should be written. Before this time, a lot of poets went based on how they thought it sounded and what the artist themselves thought that they should put into the poetry, but he kind of flips that on its ear. And this is actually one of those responses to the critics that criticized him, and saying that their poetry was not correct, that it should follow the rules of poetry. And so he takes the reader through several different scenarios they may encounter. He talks about, being by the sea. He talks about breezes. He emphasizes nature and a lot of mythology in this text. As a result of it being part of his bigger essay on criticism, again, it's his guide to writing poetry. He's responding to the people that aren't doing it correctly. And of course, not everybody took kindly to that, but as a result, now more and more poetry has been written according to the rules. He explained in one of his views was that sound must match the content of the poem. So while you may write 3 lines of poetry, if it doesn't sound right and if it doesn't rhyme correctly, then he did not believe it was poetry, and many historians would agree with him on that. One of the first lines of the poem is that true ease comes in writing from art and not chance. And that's where he's saying, it comes in ease of writing as far as following the rules, and it comes from art, which is following the rules, not just, writing stuff down and hoping it works out. So my reaction to the poem, I thought it was a very different poem from others that I've read. Most of them have a set theme or a set meaning. This one doesn't really. Like I said, it's just more of a tutorial than anything. His central argument is that poetry should be written. It should not just be imagined. It shouldn't just be thought up. It's not traditional in any stance. And his writing was very satirical. And the fact that this is a response to critics, and this poem is a guideline to one of the best poets of the 18th century, a guide into how he views poetry and how, that legend thinks it should be written.
So this poem, I liked it once I realized it was kind of just a massive clapback to everybody that he didn't like. But it was kind of difficult to read and understand at first, but the more you reread it, the more it would make sense. And it provides instructions and a critique of how to write poetry. And he states that a poem, it has to utilize emotion, and it can't just not ruffle any feathers, and it has to have an easily running meter, and he uses allusion to mythology to illustrate all of his points, and he conveys that poetry is not easy, and it takes skill, and you can't just do whatever you want to make it poetry. And he sort of flexes by demonstrating it all by using his own skill in his critique. And this is kind of very on brand for Alexander Pope, because he was a satirical writer, and he would have a reputation for critiquing and mocking rivals in his own pieces and write lines critiquing them in his own works.